Well, while Peter's sorting himself out, I might as well say hello.
Yeah.
Nick, President of Queensland Branch of AHSA. Welcome to our meeting tonight. We had 51 people at our last Zoom meeting, and that was with aviation archaeologist Daniel Lay, and he was talking about the investigation director of Brewster Buffalo in northeastern Victoria, in July 42, and examining examination of airfields used by the Empire Air Training School scheme. Tonight, coming along shortly, will be Phil Vabre from Melbourne AHSA. It's solving Circe, the 72-year mystery of the lost flying boat. Just one other thing before we go. On the 11th of June, AHSA Victoria have advised that they've proposed to hold a Zoom meeting, and they're going to change the date of their meeting from the last Wednesday of the month to a date near the middle of the month, so it won't clash with our Zoom meeting. On that basis, we, Queensland, are not scheduling a mid-June Zoom meeting, such as we have done in mid-May. And next month, for AHSAQ, on a regular meeting night of Friday, 26th of June, we'll be having another Zoom meeting with Justin Taylor about Pacific Rex. So let's introduce Phil Vabre now from Melbourne and his story.
Just one quick thing.
Go ahead.
Just one thing, Warwick, before we go. I'll also be sending out about another Zoom meeting. It's the RAAF History and Heritage Group in Air Force. They're having their second Zoom meeting. I did their first one for them a couple of weeks ago. They're having one on the 5th of June. David Lunny, author of a book on 453 Squadron, will be talking on 453 Squadron. Our group captain, David Fredericks, who I don't think's logged on tonight, said I can invite our AHSA members to sit in on that Zoom meeting. So I'll send that invite out tomorrow. That's on the 5th of June. Sorry for the interruption. Back to you, Warwick.
Well, I'm ready to throw to Phil now. Are you there and ready, Phil?
I am, Warwick.
Okay, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Peter and Warwick and the AHSA members in Queensland for inviting me to talk tonight. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint screen with you. I hope this works, so you don't have to look at my face all night. Oops, hang on a sec. Do step one first. Right, can you see that?
We can indeed, Phil.
Yep.
Good work. Okay, here we go then. So normally I'd just like to talk to the slides, and I don't like to read things, but tonight I'm going to read because I've got a lot of information. Some of it's quite detailed, and I want to make sure that I don't miss anything. So my apologies for that. Righto, so I was going to say 72 years ago, but that was when I first wrote this. So we're now something like 77 years ago. The Qantas flying boat Circe vanished without trace on a flight from Java to Broome. And tonight, what I want to tell you about is the dramatic story of Circe's last flight, the aftermath, and how recent research finally solved the mystery of Circe's disappearance. It's not just a story about a missing aeroplane, though. It's also a story about the massive power of the internet to allow people around the world to collaborate in ways that would have been impossible not that long ago. And most of all, it's a story about people. So let me set the scene. As many of you will know, after several years of political and technical wrangling with Britain, in 1937, the Australian government agreed to participate in the Empire Airmail scheme. This was an imaginative and bold scheme to improve communications throughout the British Empire, using a fleet of large flying boats to dramatically reduce the cost of sending mail by air. Under the terms of the agreement between the British and Australian governments, the Australian airline Qantas Empire Airways would work in partnership with the British airline Imperial Airways, which became British Overseas Airways Corporation, or BOAC, in 1940. Qantas was responsible for the Sydney to Singapore section of the route to England, Australia being the only dominion to operate its own part of the scheme. Qantas owned 6 of the elegant new short S-23 Empire flying boats that were built to operate the scheme, but these were interchanged with Imperial Airways boats. That is, the aircraft operated all the way to England and back, but the Qantas crews only operated as far as Singapore, and then the aircraft was taken on by BIAC, Imperial Airways crew. These arrangements were conditions established by the Australian government for participation in the scheme, as they gave Australia control over that part of the route directly in her interest, as well as over the aircraft necessary to operate it. It turned out to be a very shrewd decision. The international section of the route, as initially established, went from Darwin to Singapore via refuelling stops at Kopang on Timor and Beamer, with a night stop at Surabaya. The next day, the service operated to Batavia, the capital of the Netherlands East Indies, and then to Singapore and what was then Malaya. Soon after the start of the Second World War in 1940, events in Europe forced the abandonment of the Mediterranean and European sections of the route to Britain. The Empire Air Service was then reorganised into the famous Horseshoe route from Australia up through Southeast Asia, across India and to the Middle East, and down the east coast of Africa to a new terminus at Durban in South Africa. However, the entry of Japan into the World War on the 7th of December 1941, or the 8th of December for those of us on the other side of the international dateline, changed everything at the eastern end of the route. Japanese assaults on Siam, or Thailand, Burma and Malaya quickly made the Empire air route untenably dangerous. Services were quickly rerouted further to the west on a pre-planned diversion to avoid the most dangerous areas, although marauding Japanese aircraft were an ever-present and increasing danger. The Great British Hope, the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore, quickly came under sustained Japanese air attack. This necessitated the operation of shuttle services only to Singapore from Batavia, with the main route bypassing Singapore to the west. On the 11th of January 1942, Japanese forces, having smashed their way down through the Philippines, invaded the Netherlands East Indies. On Friday, 30th of January, Japanese fighters shot down the Qantas flying boat Corio off Timor. 3 of Corio's crew and 10 passengers perished. That night, the last British Empire forces were withdrawn from Malaya to Singapore across the causeway over the Johor Strait, and the causeway was blown up in a vain attempt to stem the Japanese tide. The loss of Corio had an immediate effect on civil flying boat operations. The Australian Department of Civil Aviation instructed Qantas to immediately move all operations to a safer, more westerly route, which had actually been pre-planned. Qantas and DCA quickly settled on a route from Broome on West Australia's remote Kimberley coast to Cilacap on the southern Java coast. A few feverish weeks followed, during which DCA and Qantas personnel laboured strenuously to prepare suitable facilities at Broome for the big flying boats. It was a period of hardship and labour, hampered by inadequate equipment, lack of suitable boats, a spell of cyclonic bad weather, and an enormous tidal range in Broome Harbour. In just 3 months from the beginning of December 1941, Imperial Japanese forces routed the British and Australian armies out of Malaya and US forces out of the Philippines and the Western Pacific. Now, in a huge pincer, Japanese forces were closing in on Java in the Netherlands East Indies, the last remaining holdout of colonial prestige. In the west, the 14th and last Qantas Singapore shuttle was flown on the night of 3rd and 4th of February, and the island itself surrendered on the 15th of February. The previous day, following Japanese airborne landings at Palembang on Sumatra, the military authorities had closed the air route between the Netherlands East Indies and India, cutting Australia and New Zealand off from the rest of the empire. That's Palembang. Finally, sufficient facilities were in place in Broome to receive the first flying boat, but it was not until Friday the 13th of February, maybe an unlucky day, that Coriolanus was able to fly in from Darwin. Even then, the sea state was so bad that only half her crew could be taken off by dinghy before dark, and refuelling was not even attempted. 2 more full days were to pass before Coriolanus could be fully fueled and made ready for departure. And she did not leave Broome for Chilachap until the morning of Monday, the 16th of February. This marked the start of a hectic fortnight for Qantas and DCA, with the pattern becoming established of a flying boat departure from Broome each day on the 9-hour trip to Java. After a night at Chilachap, the flying boat would return, crossing with that day's outbound boat. Loads taken into Java were military personnel and urgent military freight, but return loads were mostly civilians, largely women and children fleeing the Japanese invasion. In the middle of that week, another cataclysmic event occurred, the first catastrophic air raid on Darwin on Thursday, the 19th of February. In the east, the Japanese had come down through Borneo and the Celebes. That night, the Japanese, so this is the night after the air raid on Darwin, the Japanese amphibious forces landed in Dutch and Portuguese Timor and occupied the tropical paradise of Bali, which was, of course, destined to become so well known to later generations of Australians. The Eastern Peninsula also had the effect of cutting off virtually all air transport between Australia and the remaining part of the Netherlands East Indies, still in Allied hands. Most of the aircraft available simply did not have the range to do anything but hop down the island chain of what today is Indonesia to Timor before making the relatively short ocean crossing to Darwin. Some of the few aircraft that could tackle a longer crossing were the Empire flying boats, of which 6 were now stranded at the eastern end of the Horseshoe Road in the hands of Qantas Empire Airways. And the RAAF had another 4. It was against this background of an unfolding disaster in Southeast Asia that the Qantas operation was taking place. With every day, the danger increased. The confused military situation in the Netherlands East Indies and poor communications back to Australia meant that those controlling the operation, Qantas Captain Lester Brain on the spot in Broome and Qantas and DCA headquarters in Sydney and Melbourne respectively, had little accurate knowledge to work with. By the middle of the second week, news from Java suggested that it would be reasonably safe to continue operations until the end of the week, but the trips would probably need to be suspended after that or risk losing another of the valuable flying boats. On Wednesday and again on Friday, hard work enabled the dispatch of 2 flying boats from Broome. This photograph, incidentally, is, I believe, the last photograph ever taken of Circe before she was lost, probably at Darwin. You can see that she's wearing the civil recognition markings that were applied during the war, as well as camouflage. So at moorings in Chilachap Harbour on the deceptively calm morning of Saturday, the 28th of February 1942, rode 2 Empire flying boats, Circe and Corinthian. Both flying boats had arrived at Chilachap in the relative safety of the previous afternoon, with instructions to evacuate as many people as possible from to Broome. Captain Stephen Howard of Corinthian elected to spend the night ashore at a rest house run by the Javanese authorities for visiting air crews, but acting Captain William Bill Purton of Circe chose to spend the night aboard his boat. Bill Purton joined Qantas as a first officer in April 1935, and he was one of a small group of Qantas pilots transferred to the RAAF in October 1939 at the outbreak of the war in Europe. He returned to Qantas at the end of October 1941 when a route extension by Qantas from Singapore to Karachi resulted in a need for more pilots. Now, barely 4 months later, he found himself nevertheless in the combat zone. Recently promoted acting captain, the 29-year-old boyish-looking Purton had already operated 1 Broome Chilachap return shuttle as Howard's first officer on the 24th and 25th of February. Following a day's rest and another trip to Chilachap as captain, he was preparing to return to Broome. The truth was, Chilachap was a very dangerous place to be. Although in the event Chilachap itself was not to be bombed until early March, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft operated over the town every night. The previous day, the US Navy seaplane tender USS Langley, carrying 32 Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighters for the defence of Java, had been bombed by land-based Japanese Navy aircraft some 75 miles south of Cilacap. The accompanying freighter Sea-Witch managed to deliver her cargo of a further 27 crated P-40s to the Cilacap docks, but the badly damaged Langley had to be sunk by the destroyer USS Whipple. Zero fighters attacked 2 Dutch Catalina flying boats on an anti-submarine patrol over the Langley, shooting one down. After a very early breakfast at the rest house, Captain Howard went to the wharf where he met Circe's first officer, Mervyn Bateman. Bateman, a New Zealander, had joined Qantas as a flight clerk in 1938, although he was already qualified as a pilot. The following year, he was seconded to the RAAF, probably as an instructor at 4 EFTS at Mascot. In July 1940, Bateman married Winifred Gillespie, one of the few women at that time to hold a B commercial pilot's licence. The Batemans had a baby daughter, Jenny, who we'll come back to later on. Together, Howard and Bateman boarded the motor launch that took them out to the flying boats in the harbour. Overnight, much of the shipping in the harbour had left, and by dawn, the waterfront was almost deserted. The first stop for the launch was Circe to drop off Bateman. Howard, who knew Purton well, although 10 years his senior in age, saw him there, and they exchanged greetings before the launch headed for Corinthian. At Corinthian, Captain Howard and his own crew, which included First Officer John Connolly, made the aircraft ready for departure. Corinthian, whose load included most of the remaining Qantas staff in the Netherlands East Indies, was the first to start engines and taxi in the weak dawn light. Airborne at 8:38 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, or 5:38 a.m. local time, Howard had to conduct a tight circuit to bring the big Empire flying boat onto her initial course. As they swept over the harbour, Howard and Connolly noticed Circe taxiing away from her moorings and preparing to take off. Howard estimated that she would probably also be airborne within the next 5 minutes. Aware of the danger from prowling Japanese fighters, Captain Howard set course directly out to sea for the first 75 miles, intending to put as much distance between Corinthian and Java as quickly as possible. As Connolly later wrote, "We flew due south for some time after takeoff in order to put plenty of water between us and the shipping, which we judged was due for a pasting that morning." Although they hadn't discussed it as they passed the time of day earlier, Howard was confident that Purton would follow the same course. After all, Howard and Purton had flown the Broome Cilacap shuttle together in Corinthian 2 days earlier. Apart from a light haze over Java itself, the day was fine and the visibility clear, which in the circumstances must have made those aboard the two Empire boats quite nervous. At 10:09 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, which is 9:09 a.m. in Broome and 7:09 a.m. in Java, Circe's radio officer, Herbert Oates, passed a routine message to Broome radio for Lester Brain. For security reasons, in common with Qantas practice at this time, Oates used the call sign TZG, or Dear Zebra George, in the phonetic alphabet of the day, which was made up of the last two of Circe's registration letters, GAETZ, followed by the first letter. The message, sent in code, read, "Total 25 passengers. Tell Orm arrive not before 4 p.m. and carrying engineer." Orm Denny was the captain of Coriolanus, due to set out from Broome for Cilacap that morning. The Broome radio operator, Mr. J. Gornall, was unsure about the correct reception of the second code group, the number of passengers, and attempted to confirm the message was Circe, but he was unable to get any reply. After decoding the message, Lester Brain advised Gornall that it had been received correctly, but in fact Circe was carrying only 16 passengers. These included a party of Dutch diplomats formerly stationed in Malaya, their families, a Sarawak diplomat, some British Airways personnel, or BIC personnel, and a US Navy officer. Aboard Corinthian, Captain Howard also overheard the message from Circe and instructed his own radio officer to attempt to contact Circe, but he was not successful in establishing communications. Corinthian's radio officer continued to try to contact Circe at intervals throughout the remainder of the flight, but to no avail. First Officer Connolly recalled, "We saw nothing during the crossing except 2 Japanese submarines cruising on the surface in the direction of Kopang. Some 300 miles out from Cilacap, however, some of our passengers declared emphatically that they could see aircraft to starboard, sent the purser up to tell us so." Searching to the south, Connolly and Howard could not see any aircraft themselves and put the source of their understandably tense passengers' alarm down to some dark cloud in the distance. Corinthian alighted on Broome Harbour at 5:28 p.m. Eastern Standard Time after a flight of nearly 9 hours. Although she should have been close behind, Circe didn't follow. As time wore on, those anxiously awaiting her arrival in Broome increasingly turned their minds to the inevitable conclusion: Circe had gone missing. With considerable understatement, Lester Bryan wrote in his diary, "This news is ominous." Earlier in the day, Captain Norm Denny had departed Broome in Coriolanus on what had been planned as the final Cilacap shuttle. His instructions included evacuating the remaining Qantas staff in Cilacap. However, just a few minutes after Coriolanus took off, a telegram arrived from DCA in Melbourne instructing Lester Bryan to recall all machines west of Broome. Captain Denny was immediately radioed with this instruction, and Coriolanus, perhaps fortunately, turned back. With Denny back in Broome and no more civil flying boats to go across to Java, Bryan went to see the American commander in Broome, Colonel Perrin. Perrin agreed to send an instruction to Java for the last Qantas staff to be brought to Broome aboard a USAAF bomber, several of which were still making increasingly risky flights to and from Java. Over the preceding week, Broome had become the scene of intense aviation activity as the Australian centre of the air evacuation efforts from the Netherlands East Indies. Both flying boats and land planes, civil and military, and of several nationalities were congregating there. Between the harbour and the aerodrome, at times up to 30 aircraft could be found in Broome at once, which, considering Broome and its previous history, was a lot of aeroplanes. With Coriolanus back in Broome, Corinthian and hopefully Circe due in that day from Java, and Camilla and Corinna due from Sydney that day and the day after respectively, virtually the whole operational Qantas fleet would be congregated in Broome. It was clearly a prospect that worried Lester Bryan, who was well aware that the Japanese could easily intercept the radio traffic associated with all this air activity. Determining to get the Qantas aircraft out of Broome as quickly as possible, he noted in his diary, I shall not be surprised if all this activity brings an enemy raid." It was a prescient thought. That afternoon, Captain Frank Thomas arrived as expected in Broome from Sydney in Camilla. Later in the day, after Howard's arrival from Cilacap was not followed as expected by Purton in Circe, Bryan again went to see Colonel Perrin. Perrin had a number of aircraft proceeding to and from Java the following day and agreed to instruct the crews to keep a lookout for Circe en route. With communications between Broome and Java virtually non-existent, Perrin also arranged for his crews to make inquiries in Java as to her whereabouts. That night, the Japanese invaded northern Java. The following day, Sunday the 1st of March, Captain Howard departed in Coriolanus for Sydney via Wyndham. The refillers and marine staff in Broome must have been working hard as a second Empire boat was dispatched that day. Captain Norm Denny and Corinthian also left for Sydney, routing via Darwin. Following the departures, not one but 2 Empire flying boats arrived. First was the expected Captain Eric Sims in Corinna, who had left Darwin that morning. The second to arrive, though, was the RAAF's A1810 of 33 Squadron. This was the former Imperial Airways boat Centaurus, which had been the very first Empire flying boat to visit Australia in 1937. Her skipper on this occasion was a former Qantas pilot, Flight Lieutenant Keith Caldwell, with co-pilot Flying Officer Frederick Derham, who was an accountant with Qantas actually, before the war. For the first month, this aircraft had been engaged on transport and latterly evacuation flights into the Netherlands East Indies, including Timor and Ambon. None of the aircraft arriving in Broome from Java that evening brought news of Circe. Feeling that they could not just abandon Broome without making some effort to search for Circe, Lester Brain instructed Captains Frank Thomas and Lou Ambrose to take Corinna the following day to search for about 500 miles out to sea. Unfortunately, 10 hours of searching by Thomas and Ambrose in Corinna produced no hint whatever of the fate of Circe. In the circumstances, it was not justifiable to keep searching, and it was decided to dispatch Corinna eastbound to Sydney after refuelling at high tide the following morning, Tuesday the 3rd of March. It was to be a fateful delay. Corinna was still at her moorings alongside A1810 and 14 other flying boats, including 4 Catalinas and 6 Dorniers of the Dutch Naval Air Arm packed with civilian refugees, when Japanese Zero fighters operating from Timor strafed the harbour at 9:30 a.m. Broome time. All the flying boats were set ablaze and sunk amid much chaos and tragedy, as well as other aircraft destroyed at the land area. There's a picture of Broome Harbour with the burning flying boats. It was an enormous catastrophe, following hot on the heels of the shattering first air raid on Darwin 12 days earlier. In the aftermath of the Darwin and Broome attacks and other critical developments in the Pacific War soon afterward, the unresolved disappearance of Circe quickly faded from public consciousness. Along with Captain Purton, First Officer Bateman and Radio Officer Oates, Circe's complement included Purser James Hogan and 16 passengers. Bill Purton was expecting to return to Sydney following this trip and was due to be married in only a few days' time to Miss Sheila Mantle, the daughter of a magistrate who he had met while serving in New Guinea with the RAAF. As we've already noted, Bateman had a wife and daughter waiting in Sydney. Because of the uncertainty of the fate of Circe and her passengers, the members of the crew were not officially declared presumed dead until after the war, which was a source of considerable distress to Bateman's widow in particular. Bill Purton was already a member of the RAAF Reserve, but in 1943, Mervyn Bateman was posthumously appointed to a commission in the RAAF Reserve as a flying officer, effective from 27th of February 1942, so that his widow could claim a war service pension for herself and her young child, but only if his death was officially confirmed. Bureaucratic arguments over the pension rights of Mrs. Bateman dragged on for years, with Qantas supporting her in the meantime out of advances on an insurance policy for its pilots, but refusing to continue paying a salary on the not unreasonable grounds that he was in all probability dead. Arguments dragged on also over the insurance for the crew and the flying boat itself. The situation was complicated by the fact that the aircraft had been chartered from the Commonwealth Government through the Australian DCA on an extraordinary verbal contract with the US airline Pan American World Airways, better known as Pan Am, which was in turn acting on behalf of the US War Department. The charter was principally for the transport of US military personnel and cargo. Furthermore, although being operated by Qantas on an interchange agreement at the time of her loss, Circe was actually owned by BIC. Under the charter agreement, Pan Am accepted full liability on behalf of the War Department for loss or damage due to enemy action to the extent of £50,000 sterling per aircraft, or 62,750 Australian pounds, which is about equivalent to $4 million in today's money, but more in relative value. Pan Am and the US government were not responsible for insurance on the death or injury of the crew members, however. Circe was insured for normal risks on a joint BIC Qantas combined fleet policy at a value of £50,000 sterling. But since the most likely cause of her loss was enemy action, the insurers, the British Aviation Insurance Company Limited, BAIC, not surprisingly sought to limit their liability. The Commonwealth also refused to accept any liability, stating that the onus was on British Aviation Insurance to prove that Circe had been lost through enemy action. This was a view that British Aviation Insurance found difficult to accept, since it was obviously impossible in the circumstances for them to prove anything one way or the other. As a consequence, British Aviation Insurance refused to continue providing insurance for Qantas flying boats. British Aviation Insurance also noted that neither they nor the aircraft's owners, BOAC, were aware that the aircraft had been chartered to the US War Department and that this non-disclosure contravened the provisions of the policy. The claim for Circe's loss was eventually bundled up with the total claims for payment for the Chilatup shuttles, including operating expenses and the loss of Corinna at Broome, with the Commonwealth Government acting as go-between in negotiations with the US authorities. Legal bureaucratic to and fro continued for 2 years, with an increasingly frustrated Qantas complaining bitterly of the delay taking place in the settlement of the claim. Finally, in April 1944, the Commonwealth paid Qantas out for the operating expenses and for Corinna, whose destruction at Broome was incontrovertibly due to enemy action. The Commonwealth then continued with action to recoup the money from the US government. The claim was finally paid out in February 1946. However, the settlement specifically excluded Circe, since the US government also denied liability on the basis of lack of evidence that Circe had been shot down. Meanwhile, in 1945, British Aviation Insurance reached a settlement with BIAC for the loss of Circe, in the process acquiring the right to pursue the US government for the debt if it could be proven that Circe had been shot down. It seems that British Aviation Insurance launched a research project in the large collection of archival material acquired in the USA during and after the war to find evidence of Circe's fate. British Aviation Insurance then put together a lengthy submission setting out the circumstances of the war at the time and such evidence as could be found relating to Circe, which wasn't much. And in 1948, British Aviation Insurance approached DCA in an attempt to get the Commonwealth to support its claim against the US government. Once again, literally years of to and fro followed before, in September 1950, fully 8.5 years after Circe's disappearance, the Commonwealth government informed the insurers that it declined to become involved. And there, it seems, the matter rested for the next 63 years. But there was one tiny clue hiding in the British Aviation Insurance submission to DCA that would finally allow the fate of Circe to be discovered. For 72 years, the disappearance of Circe was a historical footnote, just one tragedy in a catalogue of disasters that shook the Western Allies in the early part of 1942. Although circumstantial evidence strongly underpinned the general assumption that Circe was shot down by Japanese fighters, no direct evidence had ever been found to confirm this supposition. At the beginning of 2012, I set out to write a book about the charismatic Empire flying boats operated by Qantas and their bases. Of course, I knew the outline of the Circe story, and I was able to quickly find some files in the National Archives of Australia that enabled me to put some flesh on the bones of the story. But there was still no evidence of what had happened to the flying boat. The most likely candidates seemed to be fighters from a Japanese aircraft carrier, 4 of which were known to be operating in the area around Java at the time, subsequent to their savage attack on Darwin on the 19th of February. Significantly, the files did contain statements from various participants that gave times for certain important events, including the departure and arrival times of Captain Steve Howard's Corinthian, which left Chilatup just ahead of Circe. However, it wasn't until I studied the files in detail in late 2013 that I grasped the import of the whole post-war saga of British Aviation Insurance's attempt to get the Commonwealth assistance for its claim against the US government. Reading through the BARC submission, this too placed great weight on the presence of the Japanese carrier strike force, but then a new piece of information leaped out at me. British Aviation Insurance's report claimed that there was an excerpt from Japanese records in the US War Department to the effect that on 28th of February 1942, a 4-engine flying boat had been shot down by a fighter operating out of Bali. If true, this was important information, as the only 4-engine flying boats in the area at the time were the Qantas Empires, and the only one lost in the air anywhere around that time was Circe. Mulling over how this new bit of information might be confirmed, I found an English language internet discussion forum, jaircraft.com, that specialised in Japanese military aviation history. I was aware that the Japanese government had been putting many of its Second World War military records online, as many nations are doing, but unfortunately I don't read Japanese, and especially not the archaic form of Japanese in which these records are written. In fact, a lot of modern Japanese people can't read them either. However, it was evident there were some Japanese speakers, or at least readers, among the forum membership. Quickly signing myself up for membership, I posted a request for help to solve the Circe mystery. Outlining the story and the competing possibilities of carrier fighters or a fighter from Bali, I suggested that some firm information might be found in the online archives. Within a day, I had replies from 2 members who were able to provide some important but negative information. Shortly after that, a long reply appeared from Osamu Sam Tagaya, a noted historian and author on the Japanese naval aviation from that period. Sam opened his reply with the electrifying comment, "I have a little time during the year-end holidays, so I took a look through the relevant Koto Choshos, which are roughly equivalent to the RAAF operations record books. And I believe I have found what you're looking for." Sam began by eliminating a range of possibilities, beginning with the carrier strike force, which only flew a limited number of mostly defensive patrol sorties that day. With growing excitement at the detail and quality of the information provided by Sam, I reached the bottom of his reply, and as he put it, the almost literal smoking gun. The records revealed that on the 28th of February 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy's Takao Kokutai, or Takao Air Group, operating from Bali's Denpasar Aerodrome, dispatched single aircraft maritime patrols over the Indian Ocean south of Java by 4 of its Mitsubishi G4M Type 1 bombers, better known as Bettys. One of these aircraft, commanded by Flight Petty Officer First Class Sadayoshi Yamamoto and piloted by Petty Officer First Class Noboru Ashizawa, departed Denpasar at 6:07 a.m. Java time. Just under an hour and a half later, at 7:30 a.m. Java time, or 10:30 Eastern Standard Time, they sighted a 4-engine flying boat in a position approximately bearing 250 degrees at 230 miles from base. Just 5 minutes later, at 7:35 a.m. Java time, they shot it down into the sea, expending 710 rounds of ammunition in the process. And this is the document in question, and you can see I've arrowed the 2 relevant entries, not that I can read what it says. So I was stunned by this detailed information that Sam provided. It was important. No, it was crucial evidence, but on its own, it wasn't yet proof. The next necessary step was to show that the Betty and Circe had both been in the same place at the same time. The most likely tracks flown by Circe were known: Chalatja direct to Broome, or via some position up to 75 miles directly out to sea. The next step was to plot the position of the combat reported by Yamamoto and Ashizawa. Even allowing for the navigational inaccuracies of the day, this lay smack within the range of possible tracks flown by Circe. With growing excitement, the final piece of the puzzle was to look at timings. This was trickier than it sounds, as the various archival sources used a range of time zone references, so everything had to first be converted back to a uniform reference, which incidentally is why we use UTC in aviation. After checking and double checking the archival references and my conversions, I was satisfied that I had produced an accurate timeline of known events. Fortunately, Corinthians' departure and arrival times were known, enabling calculation of the flying boat's ground speed. Circe's departure time was also known to within a few minutes, so applying sister ship Corinthians' ground speed to Circe's estimated departure time, it was possible to calculate the likely time that Circe would have reached the reported combat location. The calculation confirmed what I already knew in my heart, that Circe had, that Saturday morning in 1942, by ill fate, almost certainly arrived at the same featureless spot above the Indian Ocean at the same time as the Betty. Corinthian, just a few minutes flying time ahead, escaped entirely unobserved. We'll never know for certain exactly what happened, but it seems most likely that Yamamoto and Ashizawa and their faster bomber must have taken Circe by surprise. Circe, her crew and passengers would have stood little chance against the bomber's machine guns and powerful tail-mounted 20mm cannon. We can only imagine the terror aboard Circe as machine gun bullets and cannon shells tore into her and sent them down to an unmarked grave in the lonely expanse of the Indian Ocean, some 250 miles south of Java. It's highly unlikely that Circe's slowly dissolving remains will ever be found, or that anyone will even look for them. The courage of civil aviation personnel operating unarmed in the war zone to keep the vital lines of communication open is little enough remarked upon. But as Circe's story shows, the dangers they faced, particularly the Qantas aircrews in late 1941 and into 1942, were every bit as real as those faced by their service counterparts. Perhaps the last word in the Circe story should be left to Captain Howard's first officer, John Connolly. He had flown quite a bit with Bill Purton and recalled, "It was a pleasure to number myself among Captain Purton's crew. His never-failing good humour and wit were a big help when the going was difficult. His handling of Corinna during the most incredibly violent storm I had ever seen was, in my opinion, a masterpiece of flying." And there is one little postscript to the story. When I had worked out all of this, I put the information on a website, and within a day I'd been contacted by the family of Mervyn Bateman, the first officer on Circe. And they, three of Mervyn's relatives, his daughter Jenny, who you remember was a baby in 1942, and his nephews Trevor and Alan, were able to come down to Melbourne, or come across to Melbourne in the case of Trevor from New Zealand, to hear this presentation when I gave it at the Airways Museum in Melbourne back in 2014. And it's one of the great parts of this story is that I've been able to keep in contact with them. And last year I was in Sydney. Unfortunately, Trevor's passed away since, but I spent a lovely day with Jenny and Alan in Sydney, and Jenny took me for a trip around Rose Bay where they lived, and showed me the house that she grew up in with her mother, and we visited her mother's grave. So the human side of the story is really what makes it so special for me. So just as a sort of wrap up then, I'd like you to just silently remember for a moment Circe's crew and passengers. Bill Purton, Captain, First Officer Mervyn Bateman, Radio Officer Herbert Oates, Purser Lionel Hogan, Mr. HMJ Fine, the Consul General for the Netherlands in Malaya, Mrs. Fine and their daughter, Mr. J.M. Veruli, Consul for the Netherlands in Malaya, Mrs. Veruli and their daughter, Mr. J.H. Kramwinkel, Vice Consul for the Netherlands in Malaya, Mr. F.H. Van Halen, the Consulate Chancellor, Ms. Venselaar, Secretary to the Consul General, Miss Marriott Toke, Confidential Secretary to the Consulate, Commander Joseph A. Murphy, US Navy, Legion of Merit, Naval Observer at Sandakan, British North Borneo, Mr. Parker, the Sarawak Government Representative in the Netherlands East Indies, Mr. Colvin, BOAC Engineer, Mr. Lim Kim Swee, Typist to Malcolm Miller, BOAC, and Messrs. Omar and Abdul Samad, BOAC Fitters, all of whom perished on the Circe. Thank you very much for listening, and to them at least we can now say goodbye.
Thanks very much, Phil. That was very, very interesting. Great detective work. And I'm glad you've also found the names of all those who perished, and they'll never be forgotten. So thank you for that. Is there anybody got some questions for Phil? You need to either unmute yourself or hold your spacebar down while you talk.
Peter, it's Graham Aspinall from Townsville.
Yep.
I have a question for Phil. Just out of curiosity, Phil, the background to the origin of the name Circe, do you know what it is? I know they were called C-class boats and all their names just started with C, but do you know where Circe has come from?
Yep, Circe was a Roman goddess. I've forgotten what of it at the moment, but as you probably know, the British were famously keen on classical things back in those days.
Yep. And just an observation, Phil, some of the reference material I've seen for some of the Empire boats that were operated by the RAAF, some of the early attempts of armament on those aircraft was quite incredible. I know that I've seen photographs of a couple of machine gun positions that were sort of put on the top of the fuselage. I think there was 2 of them, and some of the armament fittings were very basic. I think they used. I think I saw a couple of World War I vintage scarf machine gun mounts on those. So it just reflected to me how really desperate those early days of the Pacific War was, you know, for the country and also for the RAAF, because they had virtually, no modern equipment to go by, and they just had to make do with what they had. It was quite incredible seeing these World War vintage machine gun fittings on this flying boat. You know, they would have been more at home on the back of a Bristol fighter or a Sopwith 1.5 Strutter, World War I vintage. So yeah, it just reflected the dire state of the nation at that time, Phil.
Well, that's correct. What you may not know is that the Empire flying boats were always envisaged as being part of the national defence assets. And that's why Australia insisted, or one of the reasons why Australia insisted on participating in the Empire ML scheme in its own right, and why Qantas owned 6 of the flying boats, which were purchased with government money, was so that if there was a war, they could be called up and used in the defence of Australia. But you're right that the RAAF had virtually no modern equipment at all at that time, so they were really taking whatever they could get.
Did the you said the RAAF operated 4 Empire flying boats in its own right? Did it also take over the Qantas fleet, Phil, during the war, or did it operate all the Empire boats?
No. So actually, what happened was as soon as the war in Europe was declared, or as soon as we declared war, 2 flying boats were chartered. So people think they were impressed, but they weren't. They were actually chartered from Qantas, but they happened to be BIAC flying boats, and they were the first 2 converted for military service. And then about 6 months later, another 2 were chartered by the RAAF, and those 2 were Australian boats. So they waited for Australian-owned boats to get into Sydney before they collared them and took them for conversion. So the RAAF had those 4, and then so Qantas was still operating the remaining fleet with the interchange with BIAC as they had previously, but obviously the RAF in the UK had also collared some of the aircraft there, so the fleet size was greatly reduced.
Yeah.
After 1942, when the horseshoe route was divided in 2, there was a pool of 10 Empire flying boats left in Australia immediately after that, of which I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but about 5 of them were lost in the space of about a month. And the RAAF were left with 3. Qantas had 2, I think. I'm getting my numbers a bit confused here because I haven't got it in my head right at the moment. But then the RAAF took another one from Qantas to replace one of their losses. So Qantas were down to nothing. And then in 1943, the RAAF gave up the flying boats that they still had left, which was only 2 by then, and they rejoined Qantas. And then Qantas lost 2 more before the end of the war, and so that left only one Empire flying boat left at the end of the war.
Yep. I think Peter could probably verify this, but I'm pretty sure one of the boats crashed in Townsville Harbour during the war with a heavy loss of life. I think it was an RAAF one. Was that correct, Peter?
Yeah, I believe so, yeah.
I agree.
That is correct. And in fact, that accident happened in the period that I was talking about here. I didn't bring it in because it was a distraction from the main story, but coincident with what was going on in Darwin and Broome, that we had the loss of one of the aircraft in Townsville as well on a test flight.
I think they lost, I can't remember the number, they might have lost, double figures in personnel. It might have been, 15 or 20 people lost their life in that Townsville Harbour crash, I seem to recall.
I don't believe so. I think it was on a test flight. There was a crew and there are a couple of hangers on board as well. So
Okay, right.
I don't think it was in double figures.
Yeah.
One of them was an aircraft woman, actually, who was on the flying boat just as a jolly.
Yep.
I've just looked up Circe while we were chatting, and Greek mythology apparently.
Sorry.
In Greek legend, a sorceress, the daughter of Helios, the sun god, and one of the ocean nymphs, Perse. She was able, by means of drugs and incantations, to change humans into wolves, lions, and swine. You probably didn't want to know that when you were boarding, even without the loss. But they certainly did like their obscure, relatively obscure names.
Seems like she might have turned them into fish.
That would have helped, yeah. I did have a question too, which was the American Murphy. When you did the presentation the first time, there'd been a few question marks about his role. Have you clarified that, or am I misremembering, Phil?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what you're hinting at. Incidentally, though, I didn't mention it, but we have been in contact with his family
Oh, great.
as well, a descendant of his. It actually took me quite a while to track him down, but we did. I mean Murphy himself, not his relative, but yeah, we did work out who he was in the end.
That's right. You there was some obscurity about it, and as is always when there's some obscurity, he was obviously a member of the, well, pre-OSS back then, but that was all just myth and rumor.
He'd had an interesting career, and I think he had left the Navy from memory. I'm stretching the brain cells a bit here, and then he got called up back again during the war, and he got sent to Sarawak, to Sandakan, in Borneo, which was a bit of an obscure place. But he was quite a distinguished chap. He'd been given an award, and he was an Annapolis graduate.
Okay.
Phil, the crash in Townsville, was that Coogee?
I can't remember off the top of my head. Yeah, I think it was Coogee. Hang on, I've got a list here.
Short Empire flying boat, Coogee A1812.
Yeah, A1812. That's right.
Now you mentioned there was a lady on board that was killed. Is that what you said?
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay, I haven't found that. I'd be interested. I'll send you an email and I'll chat about that. What I've got on my website on it, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 killed in that particular crash in Cleveland Bay on 27th of February 1942.
Yeah, so the day before Circe was lost.
VHABC.
Derek Buckmaster here. Phil, evening. How you doing?
Hello, Derek.
Hey, I had two questions. One was, what were the different local time zone references that you were trying to work through to calculate? And the other question was, did it look like from your calculations of the track that Purton flew south, or did he fly direct to Broome?
Two good questions, Derek. To answer your first one, the part of the problem is the information in the Australian files had been compiled from various sources, and people had written their timelines of events, if you like, in their reports with different time references. So some were in Eastern time, some of them were in Broome local time, some of them were in Chilliwack time, Java time. And then on top of that, the Japanese Navy used Japan time for all of their timing. So there were about 4 different time references that had to all be sort of brought to a common thing. And then I had to work out, was it summertime or was it standard, any odds and sods and that sort of thing. To answer your other question, the accuracy of the calculations in the temp allow me to make that decision. But if you look at the tracks, they diverge initially and then converge again. So it really wouldn't have made that much difference by the time they were intercepted.
Oh, yeah.
It would have been a few miles laterally either way, but
yeah,
probably, within the limits of what I could calculate, it wasn't possible to say.
Fair enough.
If you click on the chat button at the bottom, you'll see I've just sent everybody a link to a web page that I've got on trying to explain the intricacies of the all the different time zones that people use in military records. And it is a very challenging task, I can tell you, trying to sort out, whether they're using K time or Zulu time or whatever. It's very difficult. You've really got to work out somehow what time the document that you're looking at is using, what time zone, and then sort of get it back to a same base as what Phil did with his research here. But just thought I'd share that with you.
Did you use Zulu UTC time, Phil? I always find that's probably the best base.
Yeah, I think I did convert it all back to Zulu, Bob, but then, professionally, that's what we've all been using for all our lives. So it was
That's
easy
right.
to do that.
Yeah, Dennis Smith here, Phil.
Yes, Dennis. Hello.
Yeah, hi. You're mentioning about the unpreparedness of the RAAF at the outbreak of the war, but I actually had an uncle that went over in 39 to pick up 6 Sunderland flying boats to bring them back to Australia that were earmarked to go to RAF mines. And then when the war broke out, the Sunderlands end up staying in England and they're out on postal control. In fact, they didn't end up coming till almost the very end of the war. So they would have had at least some long-range armed flying boats, which would have made a bit of difference if they could have utilised them instead of the Qantas planes,
Yeah, well, that's right. The Sunderlands would have been much better, pardon me, as patrol aircraft. But as it turned out, of course, they didn't make it here.
No.
Warwick here. And of course, the Sunderlands wouldn't carry as many passengers unless they were just not in proper seats. But that was the 10 squadron who went over to collect the Sunderlands to come to Australia.
Yeah.
War broke out, so the Australian government instructed them to stay there and be part of the war effort in the UK. So 10 squadron stayed on through the war.
Just some stats. I think I noticed the maximum number of people we had logged on tonight was 43. Did you notice any higher, Warwick, at all?
Yes, 43 was the most. It came on for a while, then it dropped back to 41. And then I got to 40, 41. I went down a bit and then came back up again.
Yeah, there's been a few come and go. And right at the moment, right now at this point in time, on Facebook Live, there's 10 people watching still logged on Facebook Live as well.
And also, I broadcast it through the AHSA webpage as well, Peter, and there's 10 people watching there with a watch party.
Oh, yeah, okay. That must be the 10 that I can see here. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw 43 as the top as well.
Yeah, I've been taking notes. And 43 was indeed the highest number this time. And quite a pity that not more came along to it tonight. I think it's been an excellent talk. Thank you very much, Phil.
Definitely.
And very instructive to most of us, all of us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Based on the last time that we put it up on Facebook, we should see a lot more people see this, Phil, on Facebook during the next couple of days.
I'm glad it's going out publicly. I think, one of the greatest things for me about this was being able to give the family some closure after all those years of what had happened to their relatives. So, I hope a few more people get to see it as well.
It's a very common thing, particularly with the Americans' families, that they were told that their loved one was killed in the Southwest Pacific, and that's about all they knew. And often they assumed they were killed in New Guinea or the islands, but many of them were killed in Australia. And I even had an email today from an 82-year-old lady whose brother was killed, I think it was. And she thought he had died in New Guinea. I was able to tell her that he died in North Queensland in a crash.
Peter, Rex Ramsey has put on the chat a link to your Oz Crashes, which gives us the name of Corporal Diggle's WAAF missing.
Oh, yeah.
Look on the chat.
Oh, on the chat. Oh, okay.
I just put the link in. It's your Oz
yeah.
War, Oz Crashes, Queensland 156.8.
156. Yep, righto. Oh,
Also, Phil, I'm very impressed with your digital expertise on the diagrams and things. I loved it.
I agree. It's
A
great.
little
Thank
bit
you,
of
Phil.
movement helps, Bob.
They're beautiful drawings of the aircraft themselves. Fantastic artwork in that. In those. It looks like we're coming to an end here now. I suspect, just remind people that Thursday, the 11th of June, when AHSA Victoria will have Robert Van Verkum having a meeting there on this, and then following last Friday next month, 26th of June, we'll have Justin Taylor should say, with Pacific Rex in Queensland. There it is on screen. Thank you, everybody.
And I'd just like to say
That's really good.
that like Peter and Phil, because of my B24 research, I have provided quite a lot of that closure at my end.
yep. You'd be surprised how many people don't really understand where their loved one died.
Thank you, Phil. It was fabulous.
Yeah. Well done, Phil.
Thank you,
Very
Phil.
much.